Good morning to you. I'm glad that you found time to be with us this morning. The show is Good Morning Africa. We're going to bring you the latest news from across the continent of Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu, and as usual, it is a pleasure to have you on board the 14th of December 2022. I'll take us through quickly on the headlines, what is making the headlines this morning on the leading newspapers here in Kenya and others from the region, and then we'll get into a detailed news bulletin. We'll start with the Star newspaper. Raila, big dilemma over Ruto's push to change the law. Azimio leaders' opposition to changes may alienate him further from his members of parliament. The story is on page 4 and 5. President's team seeks to tighten anti-graft laws. There is on page 7 an EAC in 9.8 billion Kenya shillings crisis as member states default. There is on page 8 man charged with murder of sex worker. You'll find that on page 3, and the main pictorial is Kenyans showcase their creative best at City Festival. Models that you see there showcase their creative and unique outfits during the first day of the week-long Nairobi Festival, opened by Nairobi Governor John Sakaja at Uhuru Park on Sunday. Okay, that's good. The Standard newspaper. Ruto looks west to fulfill hustler dream. Whereas his predecessors reveled in Chinese loans to deliver their campaign manifesto, President Ruto hopes Europe and America will help him drive his agenda. That is on page 6. Teachers Union demands 60% salary rise. We'll find that on page 7. Supplies drugs ban hurting many, and Ramaphosa survives ouster bid. I do have details of that story. And all eyes on Morocco in French test. That story is on page 38. Why Azimio was bound to lose elections. Okay. And then the Daily Nation, fees a shocker for varsity students. Oh no. Now, rethinking higher education, proposed funding model will see fewer students get government sponsorships, and like today, when all students who score the minimum university entry grade are eligible for support. This is likely to cause a resurgence of the self-sponsored or parallel programs through which the institutions minted billions of shillings, and I think they still do. People are paying a lot of money, the parallel students. I know because I'm one. Anyway, that story is on page 7. NAT 6 new pay deal. Delegates conference to discuss 2021 to 2025 collective bargaining agreement. The story is on page 2. We too, says MCA's county politicians push for law onward fund. Usually it's a spiral effect. And then tribunal to hear secret of IEBC 4. The story is on page 4. And then Uhuru to leave Azimio, retired president, to focus on regional peace efforts, which I think is not such a bad move. And the main pictorial is Morocco carry Africa's hope in today's semi-final. Morocco's player take part in a training session at the Al Duhail SC Stadium in Doha yesterday on the eve of their Qatar 2022 World Cup football semi-final match against France. So I think that is something that I guess we're waiting to see, and we wish them all the best. All right, so let's look at some regional newspapers. From Zimbabwe, it is Sun, ally slapped with U.S. sanctions. That is the main headline. Daily News, no end in sight to energy crisis as Hwange power station's new Unit 7 suffers delay. And then Daily Monitor, armed cross-border attack leaves 19 dead. And then New Vision, government to redeploy 7,600 teachers. Okay, that is from Uganda, by the way. The Nation from Nigeria, banks get marching order to sell all Disco's shares. Tinubu promises to end banditry terrorism in Northwest. Okay, that's on page 4. But he couldn't answer those questions when he was at Chatham House and he was being asked on how he was going to tackle the issue of insecurity in Nigeria. And he instead directed one of his aides there to respond to the questions that were being posed to him. But now he says, he does, he's promising to do that. Remember, Buhari also promised to do that when he was being elected for his first term. Matter of fact, he said he'll get rid of Boko Haram in 100 days. Many years later, almost 8 years later, as he's serving his second and final term, Boko Haram has become stronger than we've never seen before, and the insecurity has escalated with now having adopted different facets there. The Guardian also from Nigeria, 2023 you will be disappointed, INEC warns PVC buying politicians, and Buhari 44 other leaders to extract deals at US-Africa Summit begins. As US-Africa Summit begins. At the New Times from Rwanda, Prime Minister Ngirente makes case for resilient African health systems, and Sowetan from South Africa, ANC rebels want out. And the Citizen from Tanzania, what Tanzania gains as host of Food Forum. The Daily News from Egypt, Al-Sisi in US to attend African-American Summit to discuss continental issues. Okay, so that is what we have on some of the regional newspapers. So now let's just get into the detailed news from across the continent, and we see what else we have in line with that. And we start with from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Heavy rainfall on Monday night led to floods in the Democratic Republic of Congo, capital Kinshasa, that destroyed many homes that cut off one of the main roads to the city. The damage left a third of the city with no water and electricity, according to authorities. Most of the dead were in hillside areas which suffered landslides. Kinshasa has about 15 million inhabitants and is one of the most densely populated capitals in Africa. Prime Minister Sama Lukonde visited the affected neighborhoods on Tuesday together with the city's governor, Gentini Ngombili. The governor said the provincial government will pay all the funeral expenses for the deceased. Authorities in the country have said about 120 people have been killed in the worst floods in this year's capital, Kinshasa. MPs at a special sitting of South Africa's parliament voted to reject a move to begin impeachment proceedings against President Cyril Ramaphosa. The president was accused of covering up the theft of large sum foreign currency from his firm in 2020, some of which had been hidden in a sofa. The debate before the vote focused on an independent report which concluded he may have violated the constitution. Mr. Ramaphosa, who is up for re-election as ANC leader, denies any wrongdoing. The African National Congress had told its MPs to block a possible impeachment, although 4 members broke ranks and sided with opposition parties to accept the report and let impeachment proceedings start. Among them was past presidential hopeful Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Now that Mr. Ramaphosa has survived the vote, he is thought likely to win re-election of his party's conference, which starts on Friday. He will then be in pole position to become the ANC's presidential candidate at the next election in 2024. And some news from Rwanda. The International Monetary Fund has approved $319 million of funding for Rwanda from a new climate change program to support the country's ambitious agenda to build a resilience to climate and help to catalyze further financing. It is the first African nation to benefit from the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, RSF, meant to help countries address climate change with longer-term, low-cost financing, according to IMF. African countries have been criticizing rich countries for not adequately funding climate change mitigation projects in Africa, despite them being the main contributors to global warming. Rwanda will receive the funding in installments. And another country that have received some money, the IMF has reached an initial agreement with Ghana for a bailout program worth about $3 billion. The extended credit facility, as it termed, is set to run for a period of 3 years. It was announced after a team from the IMF concluded its first visit to the country. It is designed to help restore Ghana's economic stability to ensure debt sustainability. Ghana is a major producer of gold and cocoa, but its once booming economy has run into trouble with worrying high levels of debt. The money from IMF, along with the government's plan to restructure its debt, should help reassure creditors. Last week, Ghana's currency, the cedi, rallied against the US dollar after losing half of its value this year. In recent months, inflation has soared to over 40% of the country is in desperate need of money to turn the economy around. And then we head over to Malawi. Support staff of Malawi's judicial system are holding a nationwide strike aimed at forcing the government to improve their working conditions. The strike, which started on Monday, has paralyzed the courts as protesters block lawyers, police and others from accessing the court buildings. Court marshals, clerks and messengers say they will resume work only if the government addresses their grievances. The striking court workers spend their time chanting, chatting and playing football and netball around the court premises. The strikers are used tree branches to barricade court buildings, denying access to judges, lawyers and other regular court users. The industrial action led to indefinite suspension of more than 60 cases on Monday alone, including government corruption trials. And a United Nations acute food insecurity report on Somalia issued on Tuesday finds famine in that country has been narrowly averted due to the response of humanitarian organizations and local communities to the crisis. While famine has not been officially declared in Somalia, the United Nations said the country is not yet out of the woods. Jens Lurk, a spokesperson for the UN office for the coordination of humanitarian affairs, said the underlying crisis has not improved, and he warned that famine remains an ever-present threat. Lurk said the situation can hardly become worse if assistance is not scaled up. He said famine is expected to occur between April and June 2023 in southern Somalia. He added that aid sectors of health and water, sanitation and hygiene are particularly crucial. The United Nations reports 5 consecutive years of failed rains, increasing global food prices and persistent armed conflict and instability has driven the population to the brink of disaster. And then to Zimbabwe now. The government has reacted following the addition of President Emerson Mnangagwa's son of the U.S. sanctions list for corruption and human rights abuses. Officials in the southern African nation say the sanctions are hurting their country's economy. The U.S. disagrees, saying corruption and wrong priorities are the problem. Now, in a statement, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control said it added 4 Zimbabwean nationals and 2 Zimbabwean companies to the sanction list. One of the individuals is Emerson Mnangagwa Jr., the son of the Zimbabwean president. Another 17 individuals were removed from the list. The additions include 2 companies, Fossil Agro and Fossil Contracting, which the U.S. says were involved in opaque multi-million-dollar deals with Zimbabwean government. George Charamba, spokesperson for Zimbabwe's presidency, said he was not surprised by the latest U.S. designations. Recently, James O'Brien, the U.S. State Department sanctions coordinator, said U.S. sanctions are not hurting Zimbabwe's economy as they do not affect banks. A much bigger problem, he said, is the tax revenue lost from billions of dollars in black market cross-border transactions that take place each year. Zimbabwe held an anti-sanctions day on October 25th, asking regional bloc SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community and the African Union to support it in calling for removal of the sanctions which were imposed in the early 2000s following alleged election rigging and human rights abuses. Zimbabwe's government is still being punished for its land reform program under the late President Robert Mugabe, in which white commercial farmers were pushed off their properties. And there lies the problem. And then we go to Uganda, and attached to DRC, and the Ugandan army says its troops have killed 11 members of the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, when they tried to enter Uganda from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The army say another 8 ADF fighters were captured along with their weapons. The Ugandan army says about 30 members of the rebel ADF entered Uganda Monday night through the western town of Ntoroko along the Semeleki River. Colonel Dio Akiki, the Ugandan People's Defense Forces spokesperson, told the media they had been monitoring attempts by the ADF to re-enter Uganda. Several ADF fighters remain on the loose, he said. To mark 1-year anniversary of the operation in November, the armies of the Uganda and DRC extended Operation Shucha, loosely translated as Operation of the Brave, for another year. The Allied Democratic Forces launched its first attack against the Ugandan government in 1995 and has operated for years along border areas of Uganda and eastern Congo. Since it was founded, the group is reported to have killed more than 700 civilians and has battled with the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo, MONUSCO. And then we go to South Sudan. A national lawmaker is calling on SPLM-IO leadership to clarify its position on the White Army group, which stand accused of attacking civilians in the Upper Nile state. Honorable John Aganyi, chairperson of the Information Committee at the TNLA, speaking to the media after the launch of the Strategic Plan 2021-2022 on Saturday. He said to clarify he asked the SPLM to clarify its position on the White Army Group, and local authorities in Fashoda County said the armed militia attacked an internally displaced person camp in Kodok on November 30th, leading to indiscriminate killings of civilians. The attack in Aburok of Fashoda County also displaced thousands of civilians, with hundreds of children separated from their parents and families. Speaking to a local media in South Sudan, John Aganyi, the head of the National Parliament's Information and Communications Committee, said the SPLM-IO needs to explain who is commanding the militias. Aganyi directed the appeal to Vice President Dr. Riek Machar, who is the leader of the SPLM-IO, asking him to order the group to return to their places. And then we end our news from Morocco, and Amnesty International on Tuesday said Spanish and Moroccan authorities contributed to the deaths of tens of people who attempted to cross into Spain's North African enclave of Melilla in June. The organization accused Madrid and Rabat of excessive use of force and abject failure to provide the truth about what had occurred. Nearly 20,000 migrants, many from Sudan, stormed the meters-high fence that seals off Melilla from Morocco on June 24th. Clashes with police ensued, in which several migrants were crushed to death and others died from falling. The death toll, at least 23 according to Morocco and at least 37 according to Amnesty and independent experts, was the worst in years of attempted migrant crossing in Melilla and Ceuta. The frontier between Morocco and the two Spanish enclaves are the European Union's only land borders on the African continent. And you are now up to date. A very good morning to you, 25 minutes past 10 here in Nairobi. Good afternoon, good evening. Right now, I'm joined from Nairobi by Wanda Wesonga, our in-house analyst, who's here to help me out with some of these news stories. Wesonga, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Averted.
All right.
I'm very happy to finally see you after 1 or 2, 3 of the close to a week of not seeing you. I had a bit of few things that I was supposed to attend to. We had the diaspora homecoming that I went to report to it. I also travel over to preserve the memorial ceremony of my mom that passed on some few months ago.
Okay.
But I'm happy, I'm happy to be back.
All right, nice to have you back, and sorry for the loss of your mom.
Thank you.
Our condolences. All right, thank you so much. So while you were away, I don't know if you have been paying attention to what has been happening, but a lot has been happening, especially in this continent. And as you speak right now, I think the leadership of this continent is in the U.S. They're meeting with President Joe Biden, and this is the U.S.-Africa Summit. And it is expected that our leaders will come back with some goodies. That summit started off yesterday, and I don't know what do we wait for. It's meant to go up to Thursday, so maybe we just wait and hear what will be some of the resolutions or what will be some of the things that will happen in that meeting. But I think they're going to look at other things that will be discussed, of course, democracy and the place Africa, the stand of Africa as far as strengthening democracy is concerned, and trade. And this is seen as a counter meeting to counter the influence. That seems to be the driving factor, to counter the influence of China in the continent of Africa. And judging from how China has been making strides in this continent, is it too late for that?
To them, it could be a bit late, but Africa is Africa, and Africans are easy to be won. Africans, based on the character or the nature of the love being given, then in this case it depends on who gives much, or who will come with the best deal on the table. that it's easy for Africa to forget about everything that happened or the deals that were there between them and the China or the other quarters. Then they'll get a new team or they'll get new suitors. Therefore, it depends with what Americans represent on the table. And it will equally depend on how our leaders negotiate. To me, it is a case of China need to go back to the drawing board and strategize. If they don't, then they stand a chance of losing. Probably they stand a chance of losing.
Okay. So according to the White House, the U.S. will commit about 55 billion US dollars to Africa over the course of the next 3 years across a range of sectors to tackle the core challenges of our time. And also this summit and this commitment by the U.S. Is built on United States' long-standing leadership and partnership in development, economic growth, health, and security in Africa, which when you look at some of these things, I think the U.S. has had a strong presence when you think about international institutions like USAID and things like that. And you can see the U.S. even when they were at the heart of fight against Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and even Kenya, we've been partners against the fight of terrorism in this region, in this part of Africa, the Horn of Africa region. I think U.S. has been instrumental in helping in the fight against Al-Shabaab and things like that. So they're saying, when you look at the recent figures, the U.S. government aid to sub-Saharan Africa have since gone down. And maybe that is because a lot of our leaders have turned to the East, or to China rather, because the US, when they give you some of this funding or money or help, it comes with a lot of preconditions. They have to look at your human rights records. They have to look at how are you operating within the precepts of democracy and how they understand it. They have to look at good governance and these other factors. And a lot of times our leaders fail to meet the threshold that will be sufficient according to the standards in the West. And so because of all this, our leaders have chosen to trade or to do business or to strengthen the diplomatic ties to China. And in that regard, the diplomatic ties between a lot of countries in Africa and the U.S. has really suffered. So the U.S. seems now to want to take a different approach, and we've seen a lot of these leaders that have been invited in this summit. You would imagine some of them, if you were to go by the conditions and some of these things that the US and the Western countries really advocate for, then some of the leaders that are present in that meeting or some of the countries that have been represented will not make that cut. So what has changed in the approach and the strategy that the US is using now as far as advancing its foreign policy and its influence and its partnership with Africa?
U.S. as a country, U.S. as a country and the relationship between U.S. and Africa, the relationship started deteriorating, or the rain started beating them when Donald Trump was in power. Donald Trump and foreign policy, and especially on Africa, was not that very good. That Africans could easily paint him or look at him as one who cares less about them as a people. And at first, when he was campaigning, he could even declare in his campaign meeting that he'll be so keen at the immigrants, in this case, the diaspora communities or these other communities that lives there. And this worked against them. That when you look at the rate at which France has struggled to get to Africa, you look at the rate Germany has been struggling to get to Africa, you look at China, that is China influence in Africa, that struggled to get into Africa. And therefore, it was a case of Americans now had to go back to the drawing board and rectify the mistakes that probably they had made, of which a good number of these mistakes came in when Donald Trump was in power. Therefore, yes, Americans have to change their strategies, their tactics, but it is a blame or it is a failure of the predecessor of Joe Biden. And if they make a mistake of going back, they will still go back to square zero again. Therefore, they have to change the tactics. Yes, probably they have realized they have lost it. And yes, you look at a country like China has really grown at the expense of the mistakes of the USA. And they were equally going to lose it big if I'm told Germany struggled to stretch a feet into Africa and have an influence in Africa. Therefore, it is a case of trying to rectify the mistakes that they had made, but it will be a bit expensive to them because their competitors have already invested in Africa, and it will mean beating your competitor.
Okay. All right. We know that President Mnangagwa, not Mugabe, President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe was one of the leaders that were invited, but I don't think he attended that summit. Maybe, I don't know if the country sent someone to represent. A couple of African leaders have not made it to this summit, and because of other things that maybe they have to deal with, like President Cyril Ramaphosa was facing an impeachment, but he survived that. So I guess he could not make it there. And others, but they did send some representatives there. So I'm not sure. I've been trying to get some information and see if at all, Zimbabwe has sent a representative to that meeting. In 2014, Mugabe was excluded from the US-Africa Summit. And, right now Mnangagwa is still under sanctions by the US itself, but they had invited him. Zimbabwe was invited to the United States Africa Summit, which is to be held, it's going on right now from yesterday to Thursday the 15th, despite being on US sanctions for 20 years now. And Washington says that they recognize that Africa will shape the future of the world, and also because the United States is losing out, of course, like we have said there, to China diplomatically. And Zimbabwe has been having a very close working ties with China. Matter of fact, China built for it a parliament, which President Mnangagwa, I think, opened about 2 weeks ago. And, that still makes my head spin because I don't understand that. But they did. And so Zimbabwe already, chose, to work, made its choice to work with China. And that is because of the sanctions and the difficult conditions that the Western world has been bombarding it with. But they invited President Mnangagwa. I don't think he's gone. I don't think President Mnangagwa has gone. And I'm still trying to see if at all the country has sent a representative to that summit. And just yesterday, not even yesterday, on Monday, the US announced that it is sanctioning the son of President Mnangagwa, him among and others as well. So Zimbabwe's government has reacted following the addition of President Emerson Mnangagwa's son on a US sanctions list for corruption and human rights abuses. So corruption and human rights abuses, let's look at that. So they have sanctioned, President Mnangagwa over that. But I don't know if Rwanda's Paul Kagame has been. I'm sure he was invited. I don't know if he's shown up there. I'm sure he has, and it's interesting because when you look at even a country like Cameroon and what has been happening in Cameroon, a country like Gabon, I'm sure it was invited. Gabon was invited. Which other country that is notorious with these human rights abuses and corruption? All of these countries, but they have been invited. But since I guess President Mnangagwa refused to attend this summit in person, because you can't have him attend this summit in person, and yet he's still under sanctions. So you've decided you lift these sanctions for X amount of time to allow him to come. I don't know, but there's some level of, is it disrespect? I don't know how to look at it. So anyway, President Mnangagwa has not gone. So now what we're now seeing is his son has been sanctioned over corruption and human rights abuses, and yet we do have a lot of, and we're not saying perhaps he's not participated in corruption, or he has not participated in whatever it is that is being accused. We don't have proof of that. But there are a lot of leaders in this continent that have worse track records as far as corruption and human rights abuses. So what is it between the West and Zimbabwe that they have to find a need and a way to always put these targeted sanctions, especially now to key figures? Now we see the son of President Emmerson Mnangagwa, Samuel Tawish. Good morning, and I see you just joined us.
Good morning to you, Miriam Ogutu. Good morning also to my colleague panelist, that is Mr. Wanda, and indeed our viewers who are watching this program in Kenya, Africa, and the rest of the world. It is my pleasure to join you in this program, Miriam. Good morning.
All right, so maybe you could attempt to answer my question. What is it about the West and Zimbabwe as far as the sanctions and some of these issues that they raise that we see it's very prevalent across Africa anyway, but when it's Zimbabwe, it's different?
Well, Miriam, it appears there's an apparent disaffection by the West towards Zimbabwe in particular. But again, when it comes to the issue of the corruption perception and the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe and what the West takes of Zimbabwe, we cannot quite be able to reprimand the West simply because of the recent steps they have taken against Zimbabwe. Because again, they got their own measures, they got their own standards of approval as to which, say, nations they will give these approvals or even invitations in as far as of course, the meeting is concerned. But again, generally, Miriam, in as much as Zimbabwe, during the reign of President Emmerson Mnangagwa, has tried its level best, really, to redeem its position, to redeem its image, not only in the continent of Africa, but I think generally also globally, there's still a long way to go. And maybe according to the estimation of the Western power countries, maybe they're still way too far or anywhere near really to be able to really satisfy the standards and the parameters that they deem are recognizable globally in terms of the human rights abuses, in terms of dealing with corruption. And you know that this has all along also stemmed during the regime of the now late President Robert Mugabe. I mean, Zimbabwe as a nation have not quite had a cordial relationship with the West because of the perception that maybe Zimbabwe as a nation and maybe and particularly those in authority have not been so much keen on respecting the human rights and making sure that there's open, there's democracy and also respect, say, for example, for other rights of the ordinary citizens in Zimbabwe. And also this now question, the big monster, the issue of corruption, and which, you know, the Western power countries always have reprimanded Zimbabwe on it. And I think, therefore, this is just a call for President Emmerson Mnangagwa to rise up to the occasion and try his level best, not only to redeem his own image as the president, but also try to reduce, if not to eliminate, that negative perception about how Zimbabwe is dealing with the general affairs in Zimbabwe today.
Okay. All right. Thank you. From the list of the countries that were not invited to that summit, I think it's only Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Sudan, and that is because of the coups that happened. And African Union suspended these countries from the African Union, and because of that, the US said since they've been suspended from the African Union, so we cannot invite them. And of course, Eritrea, the US has always held the position that it is a pariah state, so it has no business dealing with Isaias Afwerki. So 5 countries are not really invited, but you know, the US does not even count Eritrea, but it said, you know, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Sudan. And because of the coups that happen and because the leadership in those countries are being held by military juntas. So I'm assuming, sitting here, that Equatorial President Basongo was invited in this meeting. A man that is absolutely corrupt, a man that has fleeced his country, a man that is notorious in human rights abuses. Whatever is happening in Equatorial Guinea cannot even match what is happening in Zimbabwe. I wonder, please help me understand what is going on, the relationship between Zimbabwe and the West.
The relationship between Zimbabwe and the West started all years back during the reign of Gabriel Mugabe. Gabriel Mugabe was a pro-African who never bought easily into the ideas or ideologies of the West. And based on his strong stand on the ideologies from the West, a number of the Western countries were never at peace with him. They are not too friends with him. Therefore, in a way of dealing with him, they had to sanction him to try and bring him down. Although at times these sanctions are never too good because they end up punishing the innocents. Now, when you look into the sanctions that we're now having on Emerson Mnangagwa Jr., just an eve before the US African Summit, it is not him as a person that is being sanctioned, but he's being sanctioned in the sense that he's carrying out the business of his father while working with persons like Tabirei, who is a business person. Therefore, the relationship between US, Zimbabwe, and even Zimbabwe and some other Western world, it's based on the Pan-Africanism stand that was established in Zimbabwe by Mugabe. And there is this perception or there is this belief from the Western world that the ideologies or the roots of Mugabe are yet to be properly unrooted. Therefore, it is in this case the roots of Robert Mugabe that are still hitting Zimbabwe. And if you ask me from where I sit, I feel like it is, if I was in the position of advising Mnangagwa, I still could have attended this meeting, because you fail to attend this meeting at the same time you want these sanctions to be removed on you or to be lifted on you, then you're failing as a person. Instead, go face this person you feel like the sanctions are wrong, then talk it out, air it out, get on the table, then negotiate or talk about it, then find a way out. Instead, failing to attend is instead punishing the innocents that are affected with such sanctions. But the relationships are based on the Pan-Africanism nature of Zimbabwe that were rooted by Robert Mugabe, and the hard stand on the Western ideologies that were still crafted by Robert Mugabe. Therefore, the country is being either specific leaders are being targeted, and this targeting, yes, it goes ahead to punish the innocents that don't know what is happening. But it is time that these leaders get on the table, talk about these things. Then lead a way that will see Zimbabwe now get to her feet and move on.
Okay. All right. And I have confirmed that President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basongo of Equatorial Guinea, remember they had an election about a month ago, which is slightly there, and he won by 94 point something percent, almost 100%. And we know that the voting was marred with a lot of irregularities, and the manner in which elections, even in the pre-election period, where opposition, leadership was muzzled up, and there was not free, fair, transparent, the atmosphere itself. This person has been in power for 43 years. He's the longest serving head of state, not just in Africa, but across the world, except for the monarchy. And then he's been added another 7 years. So if you want to reprimand Zimbabwe for lack of democracy, but you have no problem inviting and dining and engaging with a person like Teodoro, and because I think, the country is quite rich in oil, but because of corruption, it's one of the poorest countries in the continent, which is a very sad state. And it's been having some good relationships with China. And because of that, China is trying to build a naval base in Equatorial Guinea now, which will give Beijing a new military foothold in the Atlantic Ocean in the Gulf of Guinea. And so the U.S. does not like that. So because of that, the U.S. has decided to just look away from what else is happening in Equatorial Guinea and allow this person to come who has a notorious record and all these things that they are accusing Zimbabwe. We're not saying Zimbabwe does not have its flaws as far as some of these things are concerned, but that is a norm in a lot of African countries. Why would Teodoro be there and not Zimbabwe being, of course, fine. They'll say Mnangagwa was invited, but he failed to go. But how would you not sanction that person? Tawish.
Miriam, it's obviously a very disturbing question, and we will also really struggle to get the exact answer to the reasons as to why. Of course, there are those standards, and of course, what appears to be selective treatment when it comes to these nations that we talk of. One which have had a stronghold in terms of democracy, and also just in terms of dealing with the corruption in the continent of Africa. But by and large, I think you have alluded to a very critical point as to why, for example, the U.S. Is so much keen in wooing nations like Equatorial Guinea, even at a time the thinking and the perception by not only people in the African continent, but I think globally, that maybe Equatorial Guinea and the level of democracy in that nation is not so much that we can all really desire. And really, if you are to do a comparative analysis between, say, Equatorial Guinea and some of these countries in the continent of Africa, you will contend that perhaps Guinea should be the last nation, say, to have been engaged by the West. By the West. But then you ask the question, how come that they are on the priority list? And I think you have hinted to a very, very possible reason as to why they are trying to court Equatorial Guinea. And one, because, China and maybe largely the East has been so much keen and also trying to cast her net in the entire African countries, in most African nations. And so I think this to some extent has rattled the West. And that is why you see now there's a revitalized energy and focus and determination to bring back to the fold most of these African countries that seems to be drifting away in terms of doing business, in terms of the bilateral trade, in terms of the foreign relation. And you see, if, for example, Africa decides to drift maybe to the east, then say the most of these West nations are really one which are going to lose the most. And so it is in their keen interest, or rather in their best interest, to see into it how they can be able to cut back even nations who are drifting away. And in this case, if there's anything that, say, Equatorial Guinea, and through the leadership that is President Teodoro, can be able to guarantee the West. So I don't think they will really hesitate to invite them or to have them on table to discuss issues of engagement, issues of how they're going to do trade. Because again, to the West, or rather for the West, it is about their interest. Where their interests are served the best and to the greater level is where they will pump resources and even give so much attention. And probably that is why you see there's not a difference between Zimbabwe and Equatorial Guinea and some of these nations. You have just hinted about Zimbabwe during the time of Robert Mugabe. And we all know that this is one African strongman who maybe in the imagination of the Western power countries had stifled on democracy, had overseen massive corruption in Zimbabwe and so much of human rights abuses. But again, but he did something that was exemplary, one which most African leaders who are brave and bold enough have always really praised him for, ensuring that we're not going to really oversee or to just stand by and see the Western dictates on the African leaders and Western nations. And that is one thing really that President Robert Mugabe stood for. And this never went well with most Western power countries, Miriam. And so I think because of that history, which we can trace back during that regime, it quite tells you that the disaffection has continued, even in as much as President Emerson Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe today is trying his level best to try to redeem that image and position in Zimbabwe. They still have really a long way to go. And so for that reason, I think they will want to see leaders who bow down to them, who are going to bow down to them rather, who are going to do everything as to the dictates of the Western power countries. And any nation or anyone who does to the contrary, then you're likely going to see them drift away from you, like what we are seeing today in Zimbabwe, and having that sharp contrast in terms of why they are now courting and bringing on table Equatorial Guinea and some of these nations that you have highlighted as some of the examples that the West is giving so much attention and giving so much leeway in terms of business engagement, Miriam.
Mm-hmm. And of course, among the key things that will be discussed in this summit is democracy and the rule of law. And just sticking to the matter of Obiang, because I cannot believe that the US is willing to bend over backwards over the things that it believes the administration has been pushing, and that has been the stand of the US, its own promotion of American values of democracy and all that. But they're sidestepping this notorious record of this person that has really the record of corruption and grave rights abuses in Equatorial Guinea. If you just hear and the stories that are coming out of Equatorial Guinea, this is a person who even took over the central bank of Equatorial Guinea. He's the one who runs that, because he decided other civil servants might engage in corruption if that was left to them after Equatorial Guinea discovered that it had oil. So the president is the one who actually runs that, and he rules by decree. His word is the constitution in Equatorial Guinea. But the US will be sitting in the same room with this person to talk about democracy and human rights and be accepting and be cordial with such a country and such a leadership, and have a problem with Zimbabwe. And we're not saying Zimbabwe is off the hook. I think my position is, and maybe one that I'd like to know your thoughts, is if that is the standard and that is the yardstick, can we apply it across board? Is it possible for America to stop being hypocritical?
Thank you so much. One, exactly as you put it in your last statement, America as hypocritical. America is always hypocritical as a country, and they always care about what they get in most cases in economic wise. And as we've been talking about this time in, time out, that some of this Western world cares less of what happens in Africa. They care less of the democracy that we talk about, and it's the reason why they even want to influence our elections. Because if I'm told they stand for a democratic space for free and fair elections and all those kind of, then believe me, they could only fund, but they could not be struggling to interfere with what happens in some of these African nations and their politics. Therefore, what is happening in Equatorial Guinea in comparison with Zimbabwe, it's only that one, they look at Zimbabwe then based on the hard standard that were established by Robert Mugabe, then they feel like even if they want to do business with Zimbabwe, chances are so high they will not win so much in terms of the business or the economy as compared to a country like Equatorial Guinea. Because you look at this country, Equatorial Guinea, then you will be it will easily tell you why they are so concerned or why they are so happy doing business or crafting a relationship with the leadership of Equatorial Guinea and not Zimbabwe. Because you look at the list of exports in Equatorial Guinea, then the biggest on the list is crude oil. Then you talk about oil and USA, then you realize how the kind of appetite US has when it comes to crude oil or when it comes to oil and petroleum products. Therefore, the same thing, they care less what happens in African nations for as long as they are on the winning side, for as long as they get what they want. If I'm told they cared of what happens in Africa, then quite a number of African challenges that we are facing we couldn't be having them. Like they will sponsor some of the African leaders that we know that are violating the rights of their own people, that are killing their own people, that the soldiers that are being financed by some of these nations like USA, they're the very military groups that ends up violating the rights of the children, women, and any other person cut across. Therefore, in this case, Americans are only going into the Equatorial Guinea based on the natural riches of Equatorial Guinea and what they can win from Equatorial Guinea as a country. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it has completely nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with the kind of leadership but it has to do with what Obiang promises them and what they win from Obiang, and fronting a case like crude oil among the list of the major products, or the biggest on the list of what Equatorial Guinea exports outside there, then it tells a story of why Obiang is a friend to them, and why not the hard-standing nation for so many years in the name of Zimbabwe, and why they care less about Zimbabwe and instead are so concerned with a country like Equatorial Guinea.
Okay, and still staying with some of these things that Zimbabwe is being accused of, and we see now the son of President Mnangagwa also being sanctioned. Of course, there are usually three things: democracy, human rights, and what else? Corruption. I think those are key things. But we know the underlying problem is the land reforms, which, if you have time, we'll get into. So if we are just to go by these three things that Zimbabwe is being accused of, and that is why it cannot even be admitted in Commonwealth, which is another organization that I think we don't even need to be having. I don't know why it's still even necessary, but that is not the conversation we are having right now. A country like Rwanda, let's talk about democracy, and they're accusing Zimbabwe for lack of democratic, for its democracy. They say the way it's being conducted it does not meet the right criteria. The elections are not done well, blah, blah, blah. The opposition is being, and all that. Can you compare the democracy of Zimbabwe with that of Rwanda? Really? Can you compare the two, Tawish? Do they even compare? At least in Zimbabwe, with their problems, we see elections happening, and we see a couple of even opposition leaders. Chamisa has been very active, whatever, Can you compare that dynamic with what we see in Rwanda? But Rwanda, and then talking about human rights abuses as well, the US itself has accused Rwanda under President Paul Kagame of supporting and equipping the M23. Can you imagine if that was President Mnangagwa being accused of doing such, if that was Zimbabwe? But yet, even with that accusation and the evidence that they say they have, they still don't have a problem having this head of state and this country still be part of this. The double standards again. Tawish. Rwanda. We seem to have
someone like Kagame, at times he marvels me, or at times you look at him and tend to wonder when he comes in and start talking about democracy, start pointing fingers to person like Felix Tshisekedi, because at times I feel like Africans nation and a good number of African nations were not ready for the Western democracy. Because if Western democracy calls for a term limit, that is term limits, then Paul Kagame decides use his own support base to change the constitution such that there is added more years or another term. Then what kind of democracy is that? If indeed it was the real democracy, then he ought to have gone the US way, that Barack Obama sits down and feels like, yes, I'm still young, I'm still strong, I could have still led. But because of the term limit, because of our constitution democracy, I cannot go ahead and vie again. But look at Paul Kagame, he looks at himself, feels like he's still young, he's still strong, he still can lead. Then he uses his own people, get into parliament, then they change the constitution to add more years. Look at what happens when this lady comes out now to compete. She wants to unseat him. Paul Kagame ends up imprisoning this lady and her mother. And then what kind of democracy is this? If democracy calls for free, fair election, campaigns, competition, and all those kind of. Therefore, I feel like as we're watching it, at times Zimbabwe, in as much as they're having struggles and problems, at least Sangirai could do his own, his politics, even if he was not seeing eye to eye with Mugabe. At least he could do his own campaigns. At least we ended up knowing that Sangirai exists and is the opposition leader. He was not jailed. But Kagame, you stand in his ways, you stand in his ways, then he put you in prison. Your mom tries to raise the voice, she's also in the prison. Therefore, I feel like a number of African nations were not ready for this democracy. And a person like Paul Kagame, to me, is not democratic. He's not sincere when he stands to defend democracy, because it's not a democracy. And I feel like he will still end up changing the constitution for as long as he feels is strong to keep leading. And therefore, to me, that one is not democracy.
Okay, all right, and we will continue with this conversation. I think we have to call out these Western leaders and the things that they do, and it amazes me because our leadership in this continent just goes along with a lot of the shenanigans, and I can't, I sometimes it's just hard to wrap my mind around certain things. I think our leaders should learn to take positions on certain things, but again, majority of them don't have that moral authority to do so. But I think it's time we just did things differently in this continent, because if you were having a meeting, and this a country like the U.S., it's not sincere, and you can clearly see it's really not having this summit. When you look at the underlying issues and their foreign policy and what they seek to achieve as a country, as far as even having the summit is concerned, the core of that has nothing to do with the benefit of Africa. Has nothing to do with the benefit of Africa. It has everything to do with what the U.S. stands to gain. Now they feel like their interest is being threatened by China, so they're trying to curtail that. And when you look at, like we have shortly looked at the relationship with Equatorial Guinea, now they're worried. And the key companies that were exploring the oil in Equatorial Guinea, by the way, they're from the U.S. They're from the U.S. And when President of Teodoro took over the running of the central bank, the financial, that finance ministry and the running of the central bank in Equatorial Guinea, the next day he opened over 60 bank accounts in a U.S. bank, in the same bank, in the U.S., and deposited large sums of money. Other accounts were opened through his family name, other members of his family and things like that. So U.S. has been aiding a corrupt regime. U.S. has been aiding an undemocratic regime. U.S. has been aiding a person who is notorious with human rights abuses. So they can't tell us now. But you're still going to sit there, our leadership is still going to sit there and being lectured about the importance of having a healthy democracy, the importance of upholding human rights in a country. Well, all these things are great, but they are undermining by them cooperating, by them aiding, by them, having even some of these leaders invited in such a summit. I think it negates everything that they want to preach to our leaders about. But, our leaders don't have a problem with that. They'll still sit there and they'll still listen, and then they'll come back here, and then I don't know what will happen. But anyway, I think we need to put a stop there, Wanda, unless you have something else that you want to add. I'd need some Kericho tea or something. Would you like to?
Indeed, it's bad, and I wish our leaders open their eyes. Because for US to summon them or to invite them for this meeting, it's because they feel like they're failing as a nation, not that Africa is failing as a continent or Africa is being left behind. It is a case of them feeling we are being left out, we are being beaten by China and these other powerful countries. And therefore we have to up our game, and the exploiter in this case is Africa. Let us invite these teams so that we exploit them and get back to control the world. And they are so smart that they had to start their discussion by looking at the African diaspora affairs in the US. So that you first, you buy a sweet to this kid first. You let them feel good. You let them feel like you're the nicest, you're the best person before you now get in, before now you get to the serious business. Therefore, I wish our leaders at this rate or at this era, we have leaders that are learned, our people are educated. They should not be easily fixed, but instead they should be able to stand ground. They should be able to negotiate properly on behalf of the Africans. What I didn't like, or what I don't like so much about this, that after all this, today, the President Biden, with his team, will have a small group of African leaders in the White House to discuss on the upcoming presidential elections in Africa, 2023. Why is he picking a small group of African leaders, have a closed door meeting with them to discuss our election? Does he want to plant his own leaders so that they further continue exploiting the continent? If they are sincere that they're inviting Africans on the table as African leaders, then I don't see any reason why we should have a small group of African leaders being put in a certain specific room, in a closed door room, and have a meeting to discuss politics in Africa. I feel like that is one way or the other, feeling like there is one leader or few leaders, we don't want them to interfere with what we want to talk about. And because we know they are likely to interfere with what we're going to ask, let us have these people in a certain room so that we give them conditions and ensure that we'll support them to win the elections. Therefore, to me, I feel like as African leaders should open their eyes. At this rate, we believe they are learned, and they are a person who should not be easily fixed. Then let them stand for the prosperity of the continent. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And we shall be following that meeting. I'd really want to know what will happen there. So it ends, I think, tomorrow, and then we will know. Thank you so much for watching. This is Good Morning Africa. Thank you so much, Juan Song. And of course, we did have Samuel Tawish, who had a bit of a problem with his connection and left a bit earlier. My name is Miriam. Go to enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you here some later. Bye-bye for now. Good morning.